All right. Rob Reiner is in Sleepless in Seattle. He's an actor. Rob Reiner. We have scenes in it where we're at Pike's, Pike Market, and we have a scene in the coffee shop. And we know each other. Okay, so everybody is a stranger until you know their story.
Rob Reiner and Tom Hanks first knew each other through work. They shared scenes in Sleepless in Seattle, moments filmed at Pike Place Market, a quiet exchange in a coffee shop. Familiarity grew into something more human. Families crossed paths. Children were the same age. Over time, acquaintance became history. There is a phrase Hanks has returned to more than once: everyone is a stranger until you know their story. It is not sentimental. It is cautionary. It acknowledges how easily surface impressions replace understanding, and how much remains unseen even in lives lived publicly. For decades, Tom Hanks has been placed inside a narrow frame. The calm presence, the reliable figure, the face that suggests steadiness without effort. Hollywood has often held him up as proof that integrity still exists within the machinery of power and image. That is precisely why the moment he spoke recently carried such weight. Because the composure people expect from him fractured, not loudly, not theatrically, but enough to reveal something unresolved beneath it. This was not a prepared response. There were no careful turns of phrase, no safe distance created by intermediaries. What emerged instead was restraint under strain. Grief pressed against frustration. Care collided with anger. The room grew quiet, not because of spectacle, but because no one could be certain where his words might lead. When someone whose entire public life has been defined by control begins to tremble while speaking about someone he loved, attention sharpens. Not from curiosity, but from unease. What he suggested, carefully, without accusation, was that the story being told publicly was incomplete. The prevailing narrative framed Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner as unprepared for a sudden, unforeseeable rupture. But Hanks spoke as though that framing did not align with what he had witnessed. His words pointed toward something slower, heavier, a situation shaped over time, signs that accumulated, choices made in silence. He described a household that did not rest easily behind closed doors. Not chaos, but constant tension, emotional fatigue, a sense of pressure that never fully lifted. The devotion Rob Reiner showed toward his son has long been recognized as compassion. Yet Hanks raised a quieter concern: that devotion without limits can blur into hesitation, and hesitation can become a form of absence. When boundaries are avoided in the name of love, silence can do its own damage. Much of the coverage that followed isolated only the most composed moments. When Hanks paused, regained control, chose his words carefully. Less attention was given to the places where his voice faltered, where meaning grew heavier and less convenient. The exchange took place outside a private memorial in Los Angeles. Press was held back. Cameras kept their distance. Still, fragments of audio emerged. What was heard did not sound like polite reflection. It sounded like testimony from someone who had been close enough to watch things deteriorate while others pretended they were stable. Hanks spoke of shared meals, familiar rooms, evenings where unease settled quietly and remained unaddressed. When he spoke about Nick, his tone shifted. This was not abstract concern. It was personal recognition. He described a pattern in which support slowly transformed into protection, and protection into something more complicated. A gradual collapse rather than a sudden failure. Boundaries softened again and again, always under the language of care. That framing alters the entire understanding. It suggests not ignorance, but avoidance. Not secrecy, but discomfort with confrontation. In that context, the public image of Rob Reiner, generous, patient, deeply empathetic, takes on a more difficult dimension. The same qualities that shaped his work may have constrained his decisions at home. Hope delayed action. Forgiveness postponed limits. The belief that time would resolve what needed structure. Hanks alluded to earlier moments, years before recent events, when concerns were already present. Not isolated incidents, but patterns discussed quietly, privately, in conversations never meant to leave the room. That is why his words landed differently. Because when someone known for restraint speaks this openly, it suggests a silence that has finally reached its limit. What he described was not confusion, but control. A dynamic where emotional pressure shaped behavior, where fear dictated movement, where parents adjusted themselves to avoid escalation. Not guidance, but reaction. Not authority, but caution. He referenced a gathering, unremarkable on the surface, where tension became physically overwhelming. A moment when Rob Reiner had to step away, not in anger, but because his body could no longer absorb what was happening. He returned. He reassured others. He explained that his son was hurting, and that carrying that pain was his responsibility. It was not weakness. It was devotion taken to its furthest edge. And that was the source of Hanks's visible struggle, not condemnation, but grief over watching kindness erode someone he cared about. This was not an outsider speaking. Their relationship extended beyond professional overlap. They shared a past. They moved within the same spaces, understood the same unspoken rules. When Hanks emphasized that this was not random, not sudden, it carried the weight of proximity. Details emerging since have echoed that understanding. Accounts describe something deeply personal, shaped by years of unresolved strain. Not an intrusion from outside, but pressure building within. Hanks spoke of the atmosphere in that home as suffocating, charged, waiting. He admitted there came a time when he stopped visiting, stopped bringing his own family, not out of distance, but out of concern for what the environment had become. That admission lingers, because it suggests how long this had been unfolding, and how carefully it was managed from the outside. When he finally spoke about Michelle Singer Reiner, his voice changed again. There was effort in his restraint, as if naming her required him to hold himself together. She had been present throughout, absorbing strain quietly, maintaining balance where possible. Her role, he implied, had been essential, and overlooked. None of this was offered as spectacle. It was offered as recognition, a careful acknowledgement of complexity, of fear, of regret, of the cost of silence. Not an accusation, not an explanation, but an account shaped by proximity, loss, and the realization that some truths remain unspoken until they can no longer be carried alone. What he revealed next carried a different kind of weight. It was not an argument or a warning. It was a memory, quiet, almost ordinary. A story from years earlier, shared without emphasis, but heavy with hindsight. A family trip, children still young, Disneyland, the slow crawl of Los Angeles traffic on the 405, exhaustion settling in after a long day meant to be simple and joyful. As they sat stalled on the freeway, a shuttle bus pulled alongside them. On a screen inside the bus, a movie was playing, Sleepless in Seattle, a film they had both been part of. A moment where fiction brushed against real life without anyone noticing how fragile that boundary could be. They laughed. They pointed it out. For a brief instant, it was light, familiar, human. That memory mattered not because it was remarkable, but because it revealed how close these lives once were, how intertwined, how normal things once felt. It stood in sharp contrast to what would come later. What followed in his account shifted the focus away from public figures and towards someone who had rarely been centered in this story. Michelle Singer Reiner. He spoke of her not as a headline, but as a presence, the stabilizing force, the one who absorbed tension quietly, stepped in when emotions escalated, smoothed over fractures so daily life could continue. She was described as the buffer, the person who held the structure together long after it had begun to strain. That understanding reframes everything, because it suggests this was not a sudden collapse. It was something sustained through effort, through endurance, through one person carrying more than could reasonably be held. And when that structure finally gave way, the consequences were irreversible. The most difficult truth in this story is not simply that lives were lost. It is the way those lives ended, together, bound by years of shared strain, likely trying to protect one another from a reality that had been pressing in for a long time. That detail removes the possibility of randomness. It points instead to exhaustion, to pressure that accumulated quietly until there was no room left. To understand how a family reaches that point, you have to acknowledge a pattern that exists well beyond this case. The weight carried by children raised in the shadow of legacy. The expectation, the access, the absence of limits disguised as freedom. This dynamic is not new. It has surfaced before, in different families, in different forms. The names change, but the structure remains. Nick Reiner did not hide from his struggles. He attempted to confront them through work, through storytelling. He wrote Being Charlie, a film centered on recovery and self-examination. Rob Reiner did more than support that project. He directed it. He placed himself behind the camera to help shape his son's story, hoping that art might succeed where life had stalled. That decision carries layers. A father attempting to guide his child by framing pain into narrative, trying to find resolution through structure, through meaning, through craft. Tom Hanks spoke about this carefully, but the implication was clear. Rob believed he could fix things the way he fixed stories. That if he found the right moment, the right emotional turn, the ending would change. But life does not follow scripts. Long-term struggle does not resolve itself through intention alone. It continues, slowly taking more than it gives back. There has been speculation about what finally triggered the confrontation that ended everything. Money, access, support. But what was implied pointed elsewhere. Not toward resources, but toward control, toward validation, toward a moment when confirmation was withheld, when, perhaps for the first time, a boundary was enforced. A single refusal, a word rarely spoken before. No, the idea that protection arrives too late, that the moment parents finally protect themselves is the moment everything collapses, is deeply unsettling. And it raises questions that extend beyond one family. Because what was described does not resemble a sudden loss of control. It suggests something prolonged, a dynamic shaped over time. Fear, emotional pressure, intimidation, not as isolated incidents, but as an environment. A reversal of power that is rarely discussed, especially when it involves parents and adult children, especially in families where image discourages intervention. That is why his voice carried something close to guilt. Not accusation, but reckoning. He acknowledged seeing the damage years earlier, not in visible marks, but in weariness, isolation, fear. And like many others, he chose not to intervene. Not because he did not care, but because it felt improper. Because in that world, you do not challenge another family's private struggles. You assume access equals solutions. That wealth will insulate what love cannot. But some dangers cannot be kept out with gates or guards. They live inside the home. And when that truth finally breaks through silence, it feels irreversible. What stood out most was not the content of his words, but the finality of them. He did not sound uncertain. He did not sound like someone waiting for answers. He sounded like someone who had already reached the end of the road. This did not feel like commentary on an unfolding situation. It felt like an internal verdict. And that matters, because Tom Hanks is not known for recklessness. His reputation was built on restraint. For him to speak this openly, knowing what it could cost, suggests the weight of what he had seen outweighed the need for caution. He did not soften his position. He did not distribute sympathy evenly. He was clear about one thing: Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner deserved a future. And that future was taken from them. What he did not say was just as telling. Others close to the family are said to share that sense of devastation and anger. Not as reaction, but as recognition. A shared understanding among people who believed their success protected them from endings like this, and are now confronting the reality that it does not. Wealth cannot neutralize family dynamics. Influence cannot resolve long-standing fear. And gated communities cannot prevent a collapse rooted in silence. That is the question this story leaves behind. Not how it happened, but how long it was allowed to continue, and how many people saw the signs and believed it was not their place to speak. Why speak now? Why today? The timing was not accidental. A narrative was already taking shape, one that softened responsibility, that reframed long-term behavior as the inevitable result of pressure, expectation, and upbringing. A familiar story, tragic, but convenient. Tom Hanks stepped forward to interrupt it, not to inflame it, but to stop it from settling into something untrue. He made it clear that he knew this family personally. He had seen the effort, the involvement, the constant presence of two parents who did not look away, and he refused to allow them to be quietly repositioned as contributors to their own loss, after their lives had already been taken. That refusal matters, because the culture often prefers explanations that dilute accountability. It prefers stories that feel easier to process, that spread blame until no one fully carries it. Hanks did not do that. He forced attention back to a harder reality, that sometimes love is present, sustained, and still not enough. Sometimes every attempt is made, and the outcome does not change. There is no comfort in that truth, only clarity. If you watch him closely, the restraint is unmistakable. The way his hands hold firm, not for emphasis, but for control. The discipline of someone containing emotion rather than displaying it. This was not a performance. It was not a speech shaped for effect. It was a man choosing his words carefully because he understands how stories work, and because he knows this one does not belong to comedy or romance. There is no redemption arc here. No resolution that restores balance. Only consequence. This is not a story where danger arrived suddenly, without warning. It was present, persistent, and familiar. It sat at the table. And that is what gives this moment its weight. When someone as measured as Tom Hanks steps out of silence, it suggests the truth is heavier than anyone wants to accept. Pretending otherwise only ensures it will happen again. One of the most unsettling details he shared did not come from the end, but from before. A phone call. Days earlier. No alarm, no drama. Just exhaustion. A voice worn thin. Resigned. That word lingers. Resignation is not surprise. It is not confusion. It is the sound of someone who understands where things are heading and no longer believes they can change the direction. It suggests awareness without power. And that realization widens the frame beyond one household. How many parents live in that same space, measuring every word, choosing silence over confrontation, afraid that one wrong sentence could trigger something they cannot contain? That is why this moment resonates beyond the immediate tragedy. It raises questions that have no easy answers. About responsibility, about authority, about the point at which love, unchecked by boundaries, becomes dangerous. Comparisons have already begun, drawing lines to other high-profile cases. But this situation sits elsewhere. Not control imposed too early, but limits established too late. And that distinction matters. It forces a confrontation with something deeply uncomfortable. When does someone else step in, even when a family believes they can manage it themselves? Rob Reiner believed he could. And tragically, he was wrong. There is another layer that cannot be ignored. The audience's connection. Rob Reiner's work shaped generations. His films taught people about loyalty, friendship, belonging. Those lines now carry a different weight. He was not isolated in the world. He had respect, influence, friends who cared deeply. But inside his home, in the quiet moments, he faced something he could not solve. Hanks made sure that truth was understood. He also spoke deliberately about those left behind. The siblings. He named them, described them as survivors of the same long struggle. That matters. It suggests the tension did not exist in isolation. It reached into every corner of that household. To live alongside that for years, to watch it unfold without control, leaves a kind of guilt that does not fade. Hanks's words felt protective, almost cautionary, as if drawing a line before the spectacle could spread further. Because this statement will not disappear. It will echo, in public opinion, in private conversations, in every future attempt to simplify what happened. It raises difficult questions about fairness, about influence, about whether an impartial process is possible once moral stakes have been framed so clearly. But fairness shifts when loss becomes permanent. At that point, loyalty speaks louder than balance. This feels like that. A final act of loyalty from a friend who will never make that call again. Never check in. Never ask how things are really going. And that is why this story does not fade. It is not about fame. It is not about Hollywood. It is about the limits of love. About the cost of silence. About how success and protection cannot shield anyone from consequences rooted in family dynamics. Rob Reiner spent his life creating worlds where care mattered, where devotion carried people through. He gave audiences reasons to believe that love could overcome anything. And in a quiet, devastating irony, the one thing he wanted most, peace for his family, was the one thing he could not create. That is why Tom Hanks speaking now is not just another moment. It is a warning, not delivered loudly, but firmly. A reminder that ignoring danger does not make it disappear. And that if this could happen in a place surrounded by wealth, influence, and every available resource, it can happen anywhere. What you see in him now is not fear. It is recognition. An understanding of how close darkness can sit to ordinary life, how fragile the line is between stability and collapse. That awareness carries its own physical weight. It shows in the hesitation, in the restraint, in the effort it takes to remain composed. Officials will continue to release details, reports, timelines, procedural explanations. Those facts will matter, but they will not land the way this has. Institutions provide information. What Tom Hanks provided was context. And the context is deeply unsettling. Rob and Michelle Singer Reiner were not taken by surprise in a single, inexplicable moment. They were worn down over time, gradually, quietly, by a situation that never truly resolved. Energy drained, hope deferred, strength spent on a struggle that did not turn the corner they kept waiting for. If this feels heavy to witness, if there is a tightening that lingers, it is because this is not fiction. There is no structure here designed to comfort. No score rising to reassure. No final scene that offers meaning in exchange for loss. These were real lives, ending without resolution. And the person at the center of that struggle now faces the aftermath alone, without the very people who once absorbed its force. That is the part few are willing to acknowledge. There is no Hollywood ending. Only absence. Only damage. Only a loss that, in hindsight, raises painful questions about what might have changed if the truth had been confronted sooner. This is why the story does not end here. As proceedings move forward, more information will surface. More voices will emerge. More uncomfortable realities will be named. If Tom Hanks knew this much, others did too. Those who worked in the home, those who lived nearby, those who heard fragments and chose not to repeat them. This moment is not a conclusion. It is the first visible fracture. And once silence breaks, the shape of everything shifts. Reputations will be reconsidered. Legacies re-examined. A family long associated with creativity and success may come to be remembered differently, not as a failure, but as a warning about devotion without limits, about endurance stretched past what it can hold. The silence is gone now. Attention turns to who will speak next, who will confirm what was long implied, who will finally say what once felt impossible to say. For Nick Reiner, the light only grows harsher. When someone as trusted and measured as Tom Hanks draws a line so clearly, there is little room left to retreat into ambiguity. This is raw. It is unresolved. It is painful. But it is also the only truth that remains. Rob Reiner is gone. And only now is the full weight of why beginning to be faced.